Hey students, how are you? Week 7. Yay! 7 weeks of hearing me lecture. I hope it's interesting. I think I said this last week, but I really hope that you look up some of the stuff that I mentioned. I mean, this is an overview. So I I am pointing you in directions to Google. You have the internet. Just read about some of these authors that I'm telling you about. Read summaries of some of the books that I list that were written during the time. It's really helpful because sometimes in conversations, people refer to something like Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. A lot of times we'll say, "Oh, he's such a Scrooge." And we'll make a reference. That's a literary reference. If you have not looked up any of these books, sometimes you just may not know what the references are, or you may not be able to use them in comparison in papers that you write in the future. So look up, get an idea of the characters, the stories for some of these books I'm writing about. There's some really good works out there. Okay, what are we going to talk about? 1970 to 1985. Again, this is a lot of history. I'm just hitting some of the highlights, some of the things that just kind of let you know the different types of things that were going on. 1970, I thought this was interesting. The census counted over 200 million people living in the United States. That was kind of fascinating. 1970. The first Earth Day celebration is held with millions of Americans participating in anti pollution demonstrations. It took that long for us to realize that all of the trash that we were accumulating and all of the smokestacks that we were building were doing damage to the world. Science showed us what we could do differently. Science stepped in and said, "Hey, this is not working." Ecologists stepped up and said, "What we're doing is not sustainable." So we had an Earth Day celebration. That same year, 1970, 4 students from Kent State University in Ohio were killed and 9 were wounded by National Guardsmen during a protest against the Vietnam War. And it spread into Cambodia. And the students protested, and the National Guard stepped in and shot some of the students. So that's if you're not familiar with the Kent State protest and the killing of the students, you can, again, research, find a small article. I don't expect you to read books about all of this, but find a small article. Some of this is an interesting history. 1971, Walt Disney World opens in Orlando, Florida. My dad's company was one of the first companies to go down there and do a business trip. And so he was one of the first people to get to see Walt Disney World open. They invited businesses down to host conferences in some of their hotel rooms, hoping that they would then come back and bring their families. So it worked. We eventually went when I was a kid. 1973. Like I have that twice. Let's get rid of that. Um, the 4-part Vietnam peace pacts, the Paris Peace Accords were signed in Paris, France. The announcement of the military draft ending also occurred on this date, and the last U.S. military troops would leave the war zone on March 29th. 1974, President Nixon resigns. If you remember, there was a lot of controversy about people in his campaign breaking into the campaign headquarters of the opposing party and looking up information, stealing information, him taping certain recordings. Just it's called the Watergate scandal. So again, look that up if you're not familiar with that part of history. 1978, the Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt is formulated in 12 days of secret negotiations at the Camp David retreat of the president. President Jimmy Carter witnessed the signing of the agreement between Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat at the White House. This was huge. Israel and Egypt had been fighting eh, for a long time. And President Jimmy Carter, this is one of the big things that he's known for. Look up the Carter Center. It is in Atlanta, Georgia. They have a lot of things about the peacekeeping work that President Jimmy Carter did. And I heard him actually speak on this of not giving too many personal details, he agreed. He took them to Camp David so he could talk to them personally as leaders and they could work it out without the press there, without people reporting on every single thing. They could just talk. And it was a brilliant strategy and it worked. The Carter Center has since been involved in many, many peace negotiations. So look that up, Carter Center, Atlanta, Georgia. 1975, the television show Wheel of Fortune premieres. I think that's fascinating because it's still going. So it started all the way back in 1975. 1976 was a huge year. The bicentennial of the United States is celebrated throughout the nation. Look up all the events that they had. They had a train that crossed the country that had, I think it had the Declaration of Independence on it. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and reread about that. But the train traveled across the country with the kind of traveling museum. People could see that. Lots and lots of celebrations. 1976, the Viking 1 space probe successfully landed on Mars. As you know, we're still exploring Mars. Look up NASA, nasa.gov, and look at the work that we're still doing on Mars. Interesting. I love the pictures that are coming back from Mars. 1976, Microsoft becomes a registered trademark. 1978, the United States Senate votes to return the Panama Canal back to Panama on December 31st, 1999. And we honored that vote, and the Panama Canal is now under the control of Panama. 1979, the Iran hostage crisis begins with 63 Americans are among the 90 hostages taken at the American embassy in Tehran by 3,000 militant student followers of Ayatollah Khomeini. So it started a long time of tension there between the United States and Iran. 1980, Winter Olympics were held in Lake Placid, New York. 1980 was also the year that Mount St. Helens volcano in Washington state erupts, killing 57 people. 1981, Ronald Reagan withstands an assassination attempt. He was shot in the chest while walking to his car in Washington, D.C. In 1982, now go back and look how long this has been since the Vietnam War ended. It took us till 1982 to get a Vietnam Veterans Memorial dedicated in Washington, D.C. Well deserved memorial for the soldiers who fought in that war. 1983 was the year that Sally Ride became the first American woman to travel into space. 1984 was the opening ceremony of the Los Angeles Olympic Games. Now, this also, look up this 1985, a famine relief concert organized by British artist Bob Geldof and held simultaneously in London and Philadelphia is seen in 152 countries. The 17-hour concert raised $70 million for relief efforts in Ethiopia and other African nations. This was a huge movement by artists, like the top artists. I'm not talking about just somebody you've never heard of. Top artists around the world donated their time to this concert so that people could see the concert. And all 100%, I think 100% of the funds went to relief efforts in Ethiopia and African nations. Uh, it's hunger relief, and it was an amazing movement. So go back and look that up if you're not familiar with that. Okay, bestsellers in the 1970s. Look at this. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Watership Down by Richard Adams. The World According to Garp by John Irving. The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide by Douglas Adams. The Shining by Stephen King. Centennial by James Michener. Roots by Alex Haley. Jaws by Peter Benchley. The Lorax, Dr. Seuss, All the President's Men by Bob Woodward, and Love Story by Eric Segal. Look at the diversity of titles that are on there. Of course, there was many more books written during the 70s, but we have everything on here to science fiction, to humor, to kids' books, to authors who, Roots by Alex Haley. If you're not familiar with Roots, go back and look that up. It's tracing the history. Well, I'll let you look it up. It's fascinating. I don't want to try to summarize it. I would not do a good job. but you're highlighting uh, you historical events through all of these in different ways. You're reflecting the culture of the times in different ways. You're raising the voice of different people in different ways through these books. So I really encourage you to look these up and see what part of history each one. And some of them are fun, like Jaws, The Shining. See, I don't know if I would say they were fun. That was probably not a good word. But all of these books were bestsellers, and they were bestsellers for a reason. Stephen King, born 1947. He's one of the authors I'm going to highlight today. His life. Stephen made his first professional short story sale, The Glass Floor, to a mystery magazine in 1967. Throughout the early years of his marriage, he continued to sell stories to men's magazines. Now, remember the time that things were very gendered back then, so there was men's magazines and women's magazines. Many of these were later gathered into the Night Shift collection or appeared in other anthologies. At the fall of 1971, Stephen began teaching high school English classes at Hampden Academy, the public school in Maine. And he'd write in the evenings on the weekends, and he continued to write short stories and work on novels. And it was in the spring of 1973 that he accepted the novel Carrie for publication. If you're not familiar with it, I'm not going to try to summarize these because it's like what I said with Roots. There's so much that could be said about some of these amazing works that I don't want to try to summarize them in a sentence or two. So look them up. On Mother's Day of that year, Stephen learned from his new editor at Doubleday that a major paperback sale would provide him with the means to leave teaching and write full time. 1973, Stephen King. Here's some quotes by Stephen King. My idea is to tell a good story. And if it crosses some lines and it doesn't fit one particular genre, that's good. So again, he's breaking out of all of these stories are breaking out of some of the traditional expectations of books that are published. Asked during an interview to evaluate his own writing, King, the baseball fan, likens himself to an aging but resourceful pitcher. I've gotten better in some ways, but you lose a little of the urgency. In my 1940s, the ideas were, oh, not 1940s. He wasn't even born. In my 40s, the ideas were like people jamming into a fire door to get out. There were so many ideas, and you couldn't wait to get to the typewriter, and the words would pour out. Nowadays, you're almost feeling people are looking over your shoulder and they're apt to be a little more critical. You slow down a little bit. I'm aware I'm getting older. You lose the blazing fastball and start to count more on your change ups and curves and be a little more careful and mix them up. So, Stephen King, still writing strong. I liked his analogy of himself aging as a writer. Here's a quote. The most important things are the hardest to say. They are the things you get ashamed of because words diminish them. Words shrink things that seem limitless when they're in your head to no more than living size when they're brought out. But it's more than that, isn't it? The most important things lie too close to wherever your secret heart is buried, like landmarks to a treasure your enemies would love to steal away. And you may make revelations that cost you dearly, only to have people look at you in a funny way, not understanding what you've said at all or why you thought it was so important that you almost cried while you were saying it. That's the worst, I think, when the secret stays locked within, not for want of a teller, but for want of an understanding ear. Reread that. Think about it. Think about what he's saying. The most important things are the hardest to say. Isn't that true in life sometimes? Think of some of the things that um, have been hard to say. These authors reflect that in the books that are coming out. A lot of authors at the time are telling the hard stories that nobody ever told before. Remember, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. A little talent is a good thing to have if you want to be a writer, but the only requirement is the ability to remember every scar. So he's talking about that. He's talking about you're going to have to write the hard stories, the things that you're not sure if everybody wants to hear yet, and you write them anyway. That's the beauty of these writers during the 60s, well, really starting in the 50s, the 40s. I've got all kind of stuff popping up on my computer. Here's a person who reflects that, Toni Morrison, who passed away in 2019. American novelist, essayist, book editor, college professor. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970. The critically acclaimed Song of Solomon brought her national attention and won the National Books Critics Circle Award. So, going to italicize these. I know y'all are thinking, why does she proofread while she's doing this? Because if I catch a mistake I make, I have to correct it. In addition to writing plays and children's books, her novels have earned her countless prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize and the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. As the first African American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, Morrison's work has inspired a generation of writers to follow in her footsteps. So, look, this is a quote about her life from womenshistory.org. Look her up on that. You can see more, but it was just a huge moment when she won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Here's something from nobelprize.org from their website. Toni Morrison's works revolve around African Americans, both their history and their situation in our own time. Her works often depict difficult circumstances and the dark side of humanity, but still convey integrity and redemption. The way she reveals the stories of of individual lives, conveys insight into, understanding of, and empathy for her characters. Here's a little bit of her life. 1949, decided to attend a historically Black institution for her college education. Moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard University. Comma after D.C. While in college, Morrison experienced racial segregation in a new way. So she joined the university's theatrical group called the Howard University Players and frequently toured the segregated South with the play. In addition, she witnessed how racial hierarchy divided people of color based on their skin tone. So she's in college and pursuing her dreams and realizes at a new level how segregated parts of the country still are. It's not that she didn't know it, but she was experiencing them now as a young adult. And she was seeing it through new eyes. And she was touring it and seeing it in different parts of the country. After teaching at Howard University for 7 years, Morrison moved to Syracuse, New York to become an editor for the textbook division of Random House. Then she transferred to the New York branch of the company and began to edit books by other African American authors. Although she worked for the publishing company, she did not publish her first novel until she was 39 years old. Here are some good quotes. If there is a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. She's saying, tell the stories that need to be told. If there are stories that you want to hear, tell them. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. Bit by bit, at 124 and in the clearing, along with others, she had claimed herself. Freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that freed self was another. We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. So pause a minute, reread these. Think about these quotes. Think about who Toni Morrison is and think about what these say. This is one of my favorite for anybody. This is still so valid today. Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. She's saying if other people are trying to define you, let them just hold on to their words. Those definitions belong to them, not to you. You don't have to claim them. Let nobody else should be able to define another person. I tell my students when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game. So she's putting social responsibility back on each one of us. Okay, grammar review. Capitalization. That all important. What words do we capitalize? You probably know a lot of these, but it's good to review. Capitalize the first letter of a direct quote when the quoted material is a complete sentence. You see under that, when Michael saw his mother, comma, he said, comma, quote, capital letter, we have to turn around. I forgot her present. So this is a complete sentence. We're going to capitalize it. If the quoted material just flows into the sentence, we're just using a partial quote there, you do not capitalize it. I'm just using part of a quote. I'm summarizing the first part of the sentence and then just flowing a quote in. That first word is not capitalized. If a direct quotation is interrupted, do not capitalize the second part of the quotation. So, see right here, the sentence is, I hope to get an A on my test so that I can raise my math grade and get back on the soccer team. I interrupted it with an Alex said, but I write it as if there's no interruption. So, see, I keep this lowercase, unless, of course, it's an I. I am hoping to get back on the soccer team or it's somebody's name. When quoting text with a spelling or grammar error. I lost track of where I was for just a second. I know this isn't capitalization, but this is something a lot of people don't know. And I wanted to put this in here. Um, you should transcribe. I see. I don't know why. I got to start over with this thing. When quoting text with a spelling or grammar error, you should transcribe the error exactly in your own text. However, also insert the term SIC, sick, in italics directly after the mistake and enclose it in brackets. And I didn't put it in italics. This, this right here, the SIC, says that you know there's a mistake in what you quote. If you look at the mistakes, the person misspelled Mississippi. So you know that there's a mistake in what you're quoting, but you choose to leave it the way the original person did it. So you put the mistake in there, anything, whatever the mistake is, then in brackets, in italics, you put SSE. And that lets the person reading the paper know that you know there's a mistake there. You're not the one who made the mistake. The original person made the mistake. Now, what if you want to fix it? What if that drives you crazy and you're like, I can't leave that Mississippi misspelled? Then you put Mississippi in brackets. That says, hey, I made a change. Here's something else that you can put in brackets. If the person in the quote needs a little bit more information so the readers know, anything you put in brackets says I either changed or added it. So if I would need to say all students at the high school must earn their trail badge, I put at the high school in brackets, and then I put Mississippi in brackets to show that I fixed it. That makes sense? Okay, here's more rules. Use single quotation marks to enclose quotes within another quotation. So you can see this example here. I have a quote that what the teacher said, and the teacher then is quoting the students. So in the quote inside the quote gets a single quotation mark. But commas and periods, this is something that a lot of people miss. But commas and periods within quotation marks, except when a parenthetical reference follows. So this is what that's talking about. If you're telling somebody where you got the information in text citations, then the period goes at the end after that. But otherwise, every time there's a period, every time there's quotes with a period and a comma, the period and the comma go inside the quotes. Every time they're together, they go on the inside. So you see up here, there's a comma inside. So place colons and semicolons outside closed quotation marks. So I have a semicolon, they always go on the outside. Colon on the outside. Now, then, what about question marks? They're like, well, which ones? It's depending on if the question is part of the quote. Here it is. So I put a quote question mark inside the quotation marks. He was funny when he asked, "Do all kids really go to bed this early?" That's a question that you're quoting, so it goes inside. But I'm asking a question about this quote. So here the question mark goes on the outside of the quotation marks. So question marks and exclamation points, it depends on whether they're part of the quote or not. Periods and commas, they always go on the inside, and colons and semicolons always on the outside. You're like, what? That's a lot of rules. It is, but go back over it. It's not, it's just one of those things that once you practice, the more you practice, the better you'll get. So just slow this down, go back over it a couple of times, pause this and take notes. All of these things go in quotation marks. Any short work, uh, titles of short stories, songs, essays, short poems, one act plays, episodes of television or radio series, articles and newspapers, magazines, or journals, chapter titles and books. Anything that's short goes in quotation marks. Anything else is italicized. We used to underline it all, but now people say put it in italics. Okay, introductory paragraph for those of you writing a paper. The goal of your introduction is to let your reader know the topic of the paper and what points will be made about the topic. That's what an introductory paragraph is doing, okay? It's just saying, "Hey, what is this paper about?" I'm going to introduce it, and I'm going to introduce it in an entire for a long paper, like 3 pages and over. Some will say 2 pages, but at least by 3 pages. You don't need just a topic sentence, you need an introductory paragraph. The thesis statement is the last sentence of that, and it tells the reader the specific things you're talking about. Okay, so here I'm gonna slow this down a little bit. Your introductory paragraph should look like an upside down triangle. You start out very general about your topic, then you narrow it, then you talk about very specific, and then you end with your thesis statement. You're like, what? So let's say I'm doing a paper about the Wright brothers. I'm going to start very general. I'm going to say things like, throughout history, people have been fascinated with the idea of taking flight. As early as the 5th century, we know that the Chinese inventors invented the kites and were testing the limits of the flight of kites. I'm making this up as I go along. But then you bring it forward and talk about people who tried hot air balloons. Then you bring it, see, I'm narrowing it a little bit. And then I specifically talk about the first sketches of airplanes and the first people that were testing airplanes. And then I say the Wright brothers were some of the people who became interested in developing a way for humans to fly. During their work in the early bicycle shop, the Wright brothers developed techniques that they later carried in to the process of creating the plane for Kitty Hawk and their other aviation business practices after that flight. So I'm going to talk about the work of the bicycle shop. I'm going to talk about the Kitty Hawk flight, and I'm going to talk about what work they did after. That's my thesis statement. So I started general. I just started very general. People always wanted to fly. Then I narrow it to a few people in history who developed different types of flight. Then I narrow it even more to the airplane. Then I narrow it to all the way down to the specific, to talking about the Wright brothers. And I end with telling you what I'm going to talk about with the Wright brothers. Okay, so slow this down, rethink it. It's got to be at least 5 sentences, but a good introductory paragraph is probably closer to 7 or 8. Upside down triangle. If you're talking about Harry Potter books, talk about fantasy books in general first. talk about some of the first fantasy books written. You can go back to uh, Edgar Allan Poe and things like that, where people talk about start introducing the idea of magic in literature. You can probably even go back even farther than that. And you narrow it, then you narrow it specifically to J.K. Rowling. And then you have your thesis statement about what in the Harry Potter books you're going to talk about. So it doesn't matter what your topic is, place it in history. Start very general. Okay. If you're going to talk about a specific battle in World War II, in the general statement, you need to talk about something about the beginnings of World War II. Place it in history. Then you narrow it down, and then you talk about the specific battle, and then you put your thesis statement that says, what aspects of that battle are you going to talk about? Now, don't stress about this, okay? Get a first draft down, send it to me, and I'll help you edit it, okay? If you're struggling, don't just struggle. Send it to me. Say, this is all I've got. This doesn't seem like what, how can I make this better? That's part of the education process. A lot of students try to get it perfect and then send it in. No, if you get stuck, I mean, try to get it perfect if you can, but if you get stuck, send it to me. That's all right. I mean, we all get stuck. I've had to ask people for help. That's what education is. Like, how can I improve? Never talk about your look at that. See, we all make mistakes. Never talk about your own paper. Don't say, in this paper, I will, or this paper is about. You want to start strong. Like I said, say throughout history, uh, many people have been fascinated with the idea of taking flight. Don't use first or second person unless you are asked to write a personal reflection paper. Unless the teacher says, tell me about your experiences with, use third person. Don't say, you will see that the research is very clear. Instead, use third person. The research remains clear. Researchers presented clear evidence. Those who read the research will see. Use active verbs whenever possible and give details, specific when possible. Instead of she is a poet, which is a passive verb, use an active verb. She wrote hundreds of poems in her lifetime. And write a minimum of 5 sentences in the introductory paragraph. Okay? So, again, don't get stuck. Send it in. If whatever issues that you might be stuck on, send them to me. I can help you work through it. If you're a great writer, you sent it in perfect, good. I'll tell you, great job. I'll tell you, great job, even if you send it in and have questions, because it's a great job acknowledging that you need a little bit of help. So don't just sit there and look at the blank screen. Send in your introductory paragraph sometime this week, okay? And let me know whatever questions you have.